They had named him Samuel before the world knew his face. The name was a promise stitched in whispers between two people who knew the cost of promises in that house, a father's regret and a maid's quiet courage. In a rented room that smelled faintly of soap and boiled rice, Mia cradled the promise against her chest and let the metropolis outside be a distant ocean of horns and bright, indifferent light. If you stay until the end, you'll see how truth surfaces, and why some people would burn the world to keep it buried. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications to follow the rest of this story. Mia woke at dawn because babies demanded dawn. Samuel's small hands were a warm, clumsy tangle. His breath was steady against her collarbone, a tiny drum that soothed the sharp edges of the night. Outside, a hawker pushed his cart, and a generator coughed to life. In the mirror, her face looked thinner than she remembered, the skin around her eyes mapped with lines that belonged to a woman who had learned to keep fear polite. She dressed Samuel in a hand-sewn frock, a faded blue with a patch at the knee, and wrapped him in a blanket that still smelled of the mansion. Lemon polish, old perfume, the ghost of cedar from the study. The blanket was a relic that Chief Williams had insisted she keep, as if cloth could anchor memory to safety. For now, it anchored her to the impossible, that she was not alone. Chief Williams sat in the study that no longer felt like a room, but like a ledger of decisions. He had his father's hands, broad and deliberate, yet his fingers trembled when he turned the page of an old photograph album. The house around him hummed with the silence of someone who had outlived enemies but not regrets. The portraits in the hallway watched him with the courteous indifference of painted eyes. He had been a man who thought he could buy absolution. That belief had its price. When he touched the carved frame that surrounded a younger Mia, not a maid in that photograph, but a woman in a plain dress laughing with a book in her lap, the sound of the house seemed to shrink. He had promised her a life that did not exist. In the quiet that followed, he heard instead the inventory of his failures, the betrayal, the cowardice, the long, private apologies that had never been enough. Deborah never learned to keep her hands still. She moved through rooms like a storm preening for attention, manicured nails a metronome for her impatience. The mansion had been her kingdom and then her courtroom. She had always believed that she could command the world into obedience. When the news of Mia's disappearance first reached her, it was not concern she felt, but a shift in power. Where there was uncertainty, she smelled opportunity. "You will bring him back," she told Emma on the phone, voice pressed like a nail into flesh. "Do not fail me. The name must not be lost. It cannot be useful to the Maid." Across the city, Emma listened with the mediating greed of someone who sold gossip for currency. On screen, she was glassy and bright, a woman who understood that every scandal could be monetized if framed with the right venom. She had built an audience out of other people's slips and found that cruelty paid dividends in clicks. Deborah's desperation was a product, and she was more than willing to package it. Across the city, Olivia's nights could become restless with the particular hunger of a person convinced that history owed her vindication. Where 6 months earlier she would have paused, now she acted with a speed that frightened even Amelia, who followed because choking on the same air as Deborah had taught her how to swallow loyalty without tasting it. "Make it look like an accident," Olivia said to Amelia, in a tone that made the word accident cold and sterile. She toyed with a cup on the table, rolling it between her fingers as if it were a coin that could purchase back what she'd lost. "They will think fate. They will think the gods. We cannot have his blood diluted by a maid's child." Amelia closed her mouth. The sound she made was half swallow, half surrender. She had once watched a child fall from a rooftop and had not screamed. Things like that built a scaffolding in the heart where conscience might have once lived, Now she saw lines of cause and effect drawn with the thin blue fidelity of a woman who had been coached into cruelty. Sophia lay in a hospital room with the antiseptic cold of white sheets around her like snow. The city outside was a rumor. The machines inside issued quiet beeps that stitched time into intervals. Chief Williams had flown her abroad because home could not keep her alive. The doctors had counseled, the nurses had murmured, and still she declined, not from neglect, but from something sharper, the erosion of will that comes when the body decides it has bottled enough storms. Mia had visited once, under a guise that turned the visit into a ceremony of small lies. She watched Sophia's breath, saw how the old woman's hands trembled when they reached for a photograph, and wished for mercy that would not come in a polite envelope of care. Sophia's decline was not a spectacle to be celebrated. It was a soft theft that left a house with an increasingly hollow center. Charlotte's funeral was a small one, hidden from the cameras that Emma wielded like a weapon. Charlotte had been a bridge between classes, someone who knew how to move from kitchen to parlor with a smile that wore no masks. Her death had been sudden, tea sipped, then silence. The investigators called it poisoning in a measured voice that belonged to men whose trade was words, not screams. They said the cup bore no fingerprints that mattered, that traces existed in numbers and formulas best left to laboratories. The family circled, mourning and planting themselves in roles that suited them. Deborah coiled tighter, Olivia hardened, Emma tweeted headlines as if grief were another commodity. Mia read about Charlotte's service in a headline and felt a hollow bloom beneath her ribs. She knew what the newspapers did not, that Charlotte had been kind to her, that she had once folded Mia's hem with hands that smelled of jasmine and patience. The thought of Charlotte's absence lodged in her like a splinter. It was CCTV that finally broke the carefully arranged illusions. The footage had been shot in a hospital corridor, grainy, impersonal, the kind of record that only becomes meaningful when someone with teeth decides to bite. At first, it was a blurred gathering of figures moving through a gray corridor. Then, on a second pass, the camera caught the tilt of a shoulder, the motion of a hand, the furtive exchange of a small carton that slipped into a cup. The movements were not cinematic, but human in their ordinariness. It is ordinary gestures that carry the most lethal intent. Chief Williams watched the clip twice, 3 times, until the lines of the corridor blurred into a map of decisions. Olivia's face surfaced in the feed like a photograph resurfaced from acid, there and undeniable. The evidence was not theatrical. It was a loop of moments that, when played together, framed intent. He felt the old, practiced rage that had once made him unassailable. This rage was different. It wanted not revenge, but to correct a ledger. The day the footage was taken public was the day the house shook. Emma framed the release as a scoop, exclusive footage that proved what people had whispered in dark corners. Her caption was sharp, "Justice at last." Clicks poured in like rainwater into a dry cistern. The public's appetite for scandal consumed the family's privacy, and the mansion's walls exhaled secrets into the light. Olivia's arrest was messy and loud, a moment the tabloids filmed with greedy lenses. She did not go quietly. On the way to the car, she spat accusations and phrased them like prayers. "They think they can bury me," she told the crowd. Her eyes found Mia's name in every headline and assumed a scent of triumph. Amelia watched from an upper-floor window, and the look on her face was the small, naked shape of regret. The trials opened like wounds that refused to heal. Lawyers moved through the courtroom with the practiced gestures of people who wore certainty as armor. Deborah sat like a queen under a cloud, beautiful and petty and broken in a way words could not straighten. Chief Williams testified with a voice that had been tempered by confession. He did not disguise his guilt. He described things in the flat, honest sentences of a man who had at last decided his truth could be as useful as his money. Public opinion fractured. Some called for the harshest punishments, others whispered that this was a family's private fall. Emma capitalized on both, offering interviews, exclusive insights, and curated sorrow. Her stories made money and meat of grief. It was the way of the world now. Grief turned into narrative currency, bought and sold with the click of a mouse. Mia kept to the margins. She watched the news in a shop front where old televisions flickered and neighbors murmured. When Chief Williams contacted her through Jonathan, cautious, solemn, male, she did not speak long. There were things she needed before she would return to any house with carved halls. Evidence, she told him simply, proof that they will not come again. Chief Williams heard her and felt his chest unclench a fraction. The months of distance had taught him patience he had never thought to cultivate. He moved like a man learning the contours of atonement, deliberately, slowly, with gifts of small, precise kindness. They planned the return with the discretion of people reenacting a quiet war. Samuel would not be presented as an inheritance, but as the child of a woman who had survived. The lawyers drew lines in documents, the security tightened in ways that were visible and invisible. Cameras would still watch. Cameras were their allies now, truth-tellers that could not be bribed with polite smiles. When Mia crossed the threshold back into the house, she felt the floor settle beneath her feet in a different way, as if the building recognized an integrity it had long denied. The rooms smelled of lemon polish and old money. The house wanted its old music back. Samuel, small and unfazed, reached for the arm of a stranger who had become a refuge. The reunion between Mia and Chief Williams was not cinematic. There were no sweeping embrace scenes, no vow renewed with shimmering music. Instead, there was an exchange of looks, a weathered understanding that had been paid for in years and quiet sacrifices. He saw the child and saw, in the child's mouth as he nursed, something he had wished to keep safe at any cost. Deborah's exile felt like a scene from a social ritual. She left with enough trappings to keep dignity intact, but without the networks that had fed her influence. Emma tried to salvage the shards of her career by spinning the collapse into a new series of headlines. She painted herself as the martyr of truth, which made some people lean closer and others recoil. Amelia stayed, a small figure swallowed by consequences, her loyalty now a rusted chain. But the quiet victory tasted of ash. There were unanswered agreements between men who had made choices long ago, and some doors, once opened, could not be closed. Olivia's arrest satisfied immediate hunger for accountability, yet it did not silence the ache of what had been lost. Charlotte's smile, Sophia's dwindling breath, the way the house had once been taught to speak with gentleness. At night, when Samuel slept in a room warmed by a small lamp, Mia sat by the window and listened to the city breathe.
Chief Williams kept to his routines but spent more hours in the nursery than anyone expected. He read small books out loud, fumbling with voices, and in those moments he knit himself to a future that was not about redemption alone, but about repair. There were practicalities. The legal machinery would demand testimony, dates, and public procedures that could make grief feel bureaucratic. For every private reconciliation, there was a public ritual of accountability. Chief Williams accepted that. In the courthouse, sentences were handed down with the same flatness that meteors are measured, in numbers and the slow motion of gavel and law. Olivia's sentence was neither the end nor the only answer. It was a measure, a calibration of societal boundaries that left room for human complexity. Mia found herself changing in small ways. The fear that had once keyed her voice into an unsteady pitch steadied. She learned to choose her words as carefully as she had once learned to fold linens without creases. She cultivated a tiny garden on the balcony where Samuel would one day learn that green things could be coaxed to life. The house, which had once been a suffocating tomb of manners, became a space where the baby's laughter could puncture the air and make the furniture forget how to be forbidding. But shadows gather in unexpected places. Emma, wounded professionally by the backlash, but repurposing the outrage into a new brand of redemption journalism, carried the dangerous habit of using people as spectacles. She could not resist a story that might return her to fame. In late messages and practiced smiles, she mentioned a rumor she had not yet legitimized, a whisper that there might be more to Sophia's death than people had agreed to accept. The whisper was a spark in tinder. Mia ignored the online murmurs at first. Then a clip surfaced, a short, looped excerpt from a private gathering, and it found its way to her phone. Camera as truth worked both ways. The footage was small. A hand, a tilt of a head, a laugh that did not belong to Mia but to someone she knew. The caption asked a question that smelled like a trap. What else had been hidden? Chief Williams and Mia met in the study, older photographs around them like patient witnesses. He was measured, more wary than before. "We have done what we can," he said, "but the world will keep asking questions because it does not like quiet answers." Mia nodded. She had learned that some victories required constant tending, like the balcony plants that would die without attention. "Then we will tend," she said. Her voice was small, but it carried the iron of someone who had been tested. That night, as rain threaded the city with silver, a car parked outside the guest house where Amelia slept. Someone moved beneath the dim lamplight, fingers busy with something Mia could only call malice without knowing its shape.
For once, the attempt was not subtle. The sabotage was blunt and crude, an idiocy that betrayed panic more than cunning. The device failed to do what it intended because it had been hurried and unskilled, but it was enough to send a message. This war was not yet over. The security detail had faltered once. That fracture had been enough to make Chief Williams grit his teeth and bring the full weight of his resources to bear. Cameras were repositioned, the driveway kept under a new, relentless scrutiny. The house had become, by defense, a kind of fortress, where warmth and suspicion coexisted. When the second round of footage was reviewed, there was a woman's silhouette in the glow of the lamplight. It was not Olivia, she was behind bars now. The silhouette belonged to Amelia, a figure small and stubborn, her face lifted to the lamp like a moth. She had been the tool of bigger, older grievances. Seeing her there produced a complicated response in Mia, anger murmured with pity. People break because others bend them until the seams part. The police came quietly this time. No arrest, only questioning, the kind that pricked more than it struck. Amelia sat in a chair, and the room seemed too big for her. She had the look of someone who had been waiting for the inevitable and disliked its arrival. "You did this," Mia said, because silence was an accomplice she could not abide. Amelia's eyes had the wet sheen of someone on the edge of confession. "I thought I was protecting her," she said, voice small as if apologizing to the floor. "I thought if I proved them guilty, she would see, and then she would stop." "Stop what?" Mia asked. The question was a key that fit no lock. "To be empty," Amelia said. "To be nothing." Mia thought of the many hands that had once moved crochet-fast through her life, hands that had given and hands that had taken. She thought of Charlotte, laughing over the kettle in the back kitchen. She thought of Sophia, whose breath had been a ledger of choices. She felt the child in her arms stir, and knew, with a certainty that quieted everything else, that Samuel could not be the currency by which people repaid themselves. Outside, the rain washed the street clean for a moment, and the light from the house pooled like a promise. Inside, the family bent toward a fragile, uneasy peace. There were legal steps to take, apologies to be extracted or refused, and a city that continued to hum with rumors and righteous fury. The cameras, which had once threatened to destroy everything, now also kept what mattered safe in frames that could be played for truth. At dawn, Mia walked the halls with Samuel asleep in his sling against her chest. The portraits watched, the furniture remembered, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt like a place that had been allowed to keep breathing. Outside, the rain washed the street clean for a moment, and the light from the house pooled like a promise. Inside, the family bent toward a fragile, uneasy peace. There were legal steps to take, apologies to be extracted or refused, and a city that continued to hum with rumors and righteous fury. The cameras, which had once threatened to destroy everything, now also kept what mattered safe in frames that could be played for truth.
At dawn, Mia walked the halls with Samuel asleep in his sling against her chest. The portraits watched, the furniture remembered, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt like a place that had been allowed to keep breathing.
Chief Williams appeared at the doorway and watched them pass, not with the possessiveness of ownership, but with the protective ache of a man who had been given another chance to do right. He had a list of things to fix: legal papers, security details, public statements. But tonight, his only priority was small and urgent: the baby's life and the woman who had protected it. He reached out his hand and Mia took it, not as surrender, but as an agreement to move forward together along a line that had been drawn by pain and by choice. They had won some things and lost others. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It still bore its scars. The cameras had told a truth that could not be bargained away. Olivia would face judgment. Deborah would slip into her exile and carry with her the weight of what she could not reclaim. Emma would continue to speak at the edges, hungry for attention, always hoping to turn sorrow into spectacle. But in the nursery, where a lamp cast a gentle amber over crayon marks and a tiny crocheted cap, Samuel slept, and the world temporarily was content. Mia felt for the first time since the running had begun a small, unencumbered breath. She had granted a different kind of wish than any of them had expected. She had given life a chance to be named and kept. Yet the edges of their relief were sharp. There were eyes outside the gates, and rumor has long legs. Someone in a corner of the city would not relent. Someone would try to make profit from pain, and, like a fever, it could flare again. For now, though, the house exhaled. Voices from the past had been addressed in court. Evidence had been aired. The cameras that once threatened to annihilate now stood sentinel, their lenses reframing exposure into protection. Mia thought of the future with a guarded tenderness. She would teach Samuel how to plant seeds, how to recognize the difference between courage and revenge. She would teach him that names matter, not as trophies, but as the fragile containers of identity. She would teach him that people could be both monstrous and redeemable, sometimes at once. Outside, the city brightened with a new morning. Somewhere, Emma prepared another segment, a piece that would promise to go deeper, while Deborah arranged her life into a narrower circumference. Chief Williams moved through the house with the deliberateness of a man who had made a painful inventory and chosen differently. The cameras blinked, impassive, recording. In their glass, the future looked smaller and more tender than the past. And somewhere, under the weight of 1,000 small choices, a promise had been kept. A virgin maid had, in her own way, granted the final wish of a man whose wealth had once corrupted every intention. The wish was not for amnesty or adulation, but for the simple, most stubborn kind of thing: a living child who would carry a name and, perhaps, one day choose his own. Night folded into day, and the house settled into a new rhythm. There would be more hearings, more media cycles, more whispers. But they had found a path to stand on together, guarded and watchful, not naive, but refusing to be reduced to victims of narrative. Mia kissed Samuel's forehead and whispered a vow that belonged only to her and the child. Chief Williams listened from the doorway and felt a small heat of something that might be called hope. The cameras, the law, and the city would keep turning, but for now the nursery held its light against the dark. Outside, a notification buzzed on an editor's phone, a tip that could spin the whole story anew. Inside, a mother tightened the blanket around her son, and a man smoothed his hands over the ledger of his life, trying to erase a line that would not come off. They were not safe forever. None of them were. But there was, for the first time in a long while, a future that felt guarded by truth rather than buried in it. The house had been given a second breath. The cameras had done what they were made to do: show the world what had been hidden. The rain had stopped. Dawn carved the sky into pale gold. Samuel stirred and opened his eyes to a world that had cost much to arrive at him.
Mia smiled with the exhausted, fierce love of one who knows every victory tastes of both salt and sustenance. Chief Williams stepped closer, and together they watched the child who had become, in a single, stubborn way, their living answer to a past that would not be allowed to repeat itself. The message on the editor's screen was short and sharp, the sort that arrives already dressed in accusation. It had no greeting, only a file name and a single line: Ledger, additional entries, Harrison Cole, and an attachment that refused to open until the editor, Lewis, had paced the length of his apartment twice and told himself, in a voice that sounded like someone else's, that curiosity was not the same as complicity. He opened it. Rows of numbers and names swam into focus. There were dates that matched known dinners, transfers that matched reimbursements, and then, buried under a column of innocuous line items, a set of entries for consulting fees paid to an address that traced back to a trust in Cole's name. Cole, whose foundation had been photographed at charity galas. Cole, whose face had been printed beside headlines about restitution and remorse. Cole, who had once been photographed leaving the house in a car with darkened windows the night the cameras had finally turned inwards. Lewis felt the old kinship between story and danger stir. Stories were the city's teeth. They nod and split and reveal. He imagined the headline: New Ledger ties Cole to payments. Case reopened. He imagined the phones that would ring, the lawyers who would sweep into his office, the producers who would smell ratings. He imagined the nursery, Samuel's face in an image alongside accusations, and a pit opened in his stomach. He texted one number: Emma. Her reply came fast and brisk, a professional flint: send. He copied the file into a draft, hesitated, and then, with the peculiar slow cruelty of someone stepping into a river whose current they already felt, forwarded it to the newsroom list. He added a line that read, "Verify, fast." It was the kind of line that could not be undone. Emma read the ledger in the glow of her monitor and felt at first the familiar itch of triumph. Then something colder. The ledger did not only implicate Cole. It included entries marked media management, narrative consulting, disbursement, public relations. Terms that suggested a deliberate architecture of silence and redirection. If what she held was true, the story's axis would tilt. The case that had permitted some measure of peace would crack open under its own weight. She paused, fingers hovering over her keypad. Behind her, her producer knocked at the door and asked for a runtime. "We could run this tonight," he said. "It'll finish off whatever." He stopped when he saw the look on her face. Emma's courage had often been her currency. She spent it like a person who had never had to count coins. Now, faced with the ledger that could expose a network of interests, she felt the old hunger and something else she had not welcomed in a long time: dread. She remembered the last time the cameras had focused on the house and how the light had flattened faces into spectacle. She thought of Samuel with his tiny hands curling around a blanket and wondered whether truth always required that kind of cost. Across town, Deborah had rented a third-floor walk-up with a view of brick backs and the tops of trees. She kept to a narrow routine: the bakery at 9, the laundromat at noon, a bench in the park when she felt the nostalgia for faces that were not her own. She had taken the exile as penance and shelter, folding herself into a life unmarked by bylines. The ledger arrived in the city in a different language. It smelled of ledgers and power. And when a message arrived on a burner phone she'd kept for emergencies, it read, "Someone is looking for you." Deborah's first reaction was a fierce animal denial. She had given what she could. Information when asked, a confession when cornered. She had not written checks to silence, not that she admitted. Yet the ledger suggested networks that had operated both above and beneath the law. It suggested that names she believed were dead in the past lived in accounts and trust funds, moving like underground streams. She folded the message into silence. She sat on her small kitchen floor and listened for the city's hum through the thin windows. It was then that she realized the world would not observe her absence forever. Someone would pull on the frayed thread of the story, and it could unravel in ways she could neither foresee nor contain. Mia, by contrast, lived in the small orbit of hands and green shoots.
She carried Samuel through the house like someone bearing a lamp, careful of glare. She had begun the small curriculum she had promised, a summer of seeds and patience. On a morning when the clouds scraped low and the air held the possibility of rain, she knelt beside a narrow bed of soil beneath the nursery window and showed Samuel how to press a bean into the earth. "Plant it in the valley," she told him, in words soft enough to be a lullaby. "Cover it, don't press it too hard. Let it breathe." His fingers mimicked hers, clumsy and certain. When he laughed, the sound fit the room like a final piece set into a puzzle. She traced a path forward in those small moments, names to speak when he asked, stories of the garden when he needed instruction on courage. She taught him that names were both anchor and sail. Later, when Chief Williams came by to check on the safety arrangements, he found her at the window, watching a leaf tremble in the wind. He carried with him the ledger's resonance as a heavy thing. He had heard nothing official, only the rumor that some journalist had found another thread. He did not speak of it at first. Instead, he helped Mia secure a new set of locks and consult the list of people cleared to be in the house. "You should sleep," he told her. "You have the watch of a sentinel and none of the rest." He spoke with the steady, low cadence of a man who had worked with grief long enough to know the ways it could harden and then break. Mia shrugged, an island of fatigue and stubbornness. "I am sleeping," she said. "I just have a different clock." When she told him about the beans, Chief Williams smiled. The revelation of a man who had learned to take inventory had shown him the stupendous smallness of life. He asked if she wanted more security. She thanked him and said no, that the house had enough cameras and their lenses now pointed outward to protect rather than to prey. He took her hand as if to transfer some of his steadiness into her. "If they come," he said, "we will stand in front of you." On the fringes of the city, a man who had once been called upon to advise the wealthy and the guilty sat in a study lined with books and a silence full of photographs. Harrison Cole's portrait hung in a frame that reflected a face more tired than ashamed. He read the morning coverage and watched as Lewis's piece took direction. A whisper turned into a scent and then into a rumor. He felt the ledger's accusation like a chill along his spine and thought, first with something like panic, then with a calculation about the options left to him. Cole's instincts were not conspiratorial by temperament. They had been pragmatic for years. Where younger men saw a scandal, he saw a negotiation. He instructed his lawyer to prepare a statement denying the ledger's authenticity. He tapped old lines of influence with the precise fingers of a man who had practiced the soft art of erosion. Wait, refute, redirect. But he was not a man untouched by the possibility of misstep. He had been at charity luncheons, had given speeches about remorse, and he knew the spectacle of being a man reduced to the sum of past sins. He feared, in a way he had never feared audit or debt, the sight of Samuel's face in the margins of his error. Deborah, when she learned a journalist had the ledger, felt the shape of her old life rise like a question at the back of her throat. She had made decisions that had seared her. Some she had defended as necessary. Others she had let go, naming them private and small. The ledger suggested that larger forces had always been at work, and if the truth of those forces were laid bare, the fragile settlement that allowed a child to sleep might not survive the press. At the courthouse, a clerk placed a fresh set of subpoenas on the desk of the investigator who had helped Chief Williams assemble evidence. "We may need to compel testimony," she said, a bureaucratic voice that carried its own small authority. The investigator, a woman named Alvarez, had the kind of hands that knew how to file and how to steady a trembling witness. She called a meeting with the prosecutor and with Chief Williams. The ledger had arrived as rumor. They had to treat rumor as possibility without turning it into spectacle. In a small park, Emma walked with her producer and her anger as company. She had been confronted by the ledger's moral cost and had chosen, in that crossing of ethics and opportunity, to ask hard questions in private. She sat across from Mia once more, this time with less camera light between them, and asked whether Mia wanted the world to know everything that had happened again. Mia's answer was as simple as the act of planting. She wanted truth that protected the child more than it rewarded an appetite. Emma left with her notes and a tangled weight. Her segments would be crafted with the eye of a surgeon. She would not hound a small boy. But she could not deny the ledger's implication that the story of the house did not end with a single verdict or a single confession. There were networks that needed names, and names were the currency of justice. Night arrived like a slow hand closing a book. The house dimmed to a small constellation of lamps. Mia checked the locks, straightened a corner of Samuel's blanket, and sat at the edge of his bed until his breath evened out. Chief Williams patrolled the perimeter, called in favors, and arranged for a set of plainclothes detectives to keep distance without bringing spectacle. Emma argued with herself over how much to show, her career a pendulum between conscience and the hunger for truth. Luis, back in his apartment, opened another file and found a scan of a photograph. Harrison Cole at a charity dinner with a man whose face he did not recognize, but whose smile matched a name in the ledger. What neither the cameras nor the ledger could account for were the small human habits that persisted inside the house. The way Mia hummed when she folded laundry. The way Samuel, waking in the night, reached for her with the implicit trust only infants command. The way Chief Williams, in the quiet, allowed himself the small, dangerous luxury of hope. Yet under all of it, a low current moved. The ledger's existence meant that the fragile map they had drawn was now marked by another stamp. The city had depths yet to be dredged and names that opened like old wounds. Someone with a sharp enough blade could cut the thread of peace they had woven and reveal either truth or ruin. Mia thought about the lessons she would teach Samuel, about courage, about the difference between revenge and justice, and felt the weight of the future like a hand on her shoulder. Outside, somewhere in the city's underbelly, a man who had profited from rumor and rumor's cousin, silence, considered the ledger a bargaining chip. He had watched the house's fall and partial rise with the cool eye of someone who sold stories and sometimes, in exchange for money or favor, withheld them. He imagined a sale. He imagined power. He dialed a number and promised to speak with someone who could turn ledger into leverage. Inside the house, Samuel slept. The city, for the first time since dawn, unrolled its long business, in which reputations were assets and truths were tools. The cameras, patient as ever, recorded both light and shadow. Mia kissed the child's forehead and promised, in a voice so soft she thought the house itself might not hear, that she would teach him how to plant seeds and how to keep faith with the small life. Chief Williams listened from the doorway, where the hallway's light made a thin, bright line, and he felt the fragile hardness of resolve settle in him once more. Morning would bring new calls and a newsroom's machine. The ledger's shadow was long enough to touch more than the guilty and the guilty adjacent. It would graze strangers who had little to do with its numbers. The parents of children in other neighborhoods would begin to ask questions they had not asked before. The city would fold and fold until the truth, like a knife, left its mark. For now, though, the nursery held its light. Outside, rumor walked like a man pacing the pavement. Inside, a woman and a child breathed and kept vigil over the small, protected thing that had been given to them. The house, with its patched walls and newly turned locks, had not yet learned whether it could withstand the ledger's tide. But it had learned, in the slow calculus of loss and repair, how to keep the small life at its center. The first reporter's van arrived at the corner an hour before dawn, and with it the sense that the city's appetite had been stoked anew.
Chief Williams watched the vehicle pass, and then, with the same steadiness that had carried him through countless investigations, stepped back inside to stand between the house and whatever the ledger might bring next. The reporters multiplied like gulls over the river, vans, a cluster of microphones, the stiff shuffle of men and women who had been trained to make calamity into headlines. They parked with the casual insolence of a storm, folding up tripods and unrolling logos, their breath visible in the cold air, as if even the morning were holding its own counsel. Chief Williams watched them from the threshold, hands loose at his sides, the quiet badge of a man who had seen every permutation of grief and invention the city could devise. Mia, still in the coach she had slept beside, opened the door when Emma tapped. The reporter's face was an arrangement of apology and determination. She had been up all night too, or at least she wanted to seem so. Emma carried a press pass that all but declared loyalty to truth, and in her hand the small notebook that could decide which names lived on newspapers and which slept in quiet. Emma began, then stopped. The house smelled of the lemon cleaner Mia favored and of something softer, boiled milk, the residue of a night nursed into calm. Samuel shifted in his crib, fingers curled as if around the memory of a dream. Mia's eyes were raw and steady. You can't come in," Mia said finally. There was no pettiness in it, only an economy of need. "You can stand on the porch, you can tell me what you know." Emma nodded. The cameras were already catching the first feeds, an anchor's practiced voice, the ledger's name pronounced like an accusation. Emma's hand trembled, a small human betrayal of the professional mask. She told Mia in clipped, almost clinical sentences the mechanics of what a newsroom would do. Leak a line, hold a file, trade exclusives like favors. She did not tell Mia what she wanted to do for herself, how many scoops she had left to take, or how a byline could feel like justice. Chief Williams intercepted the first volley of questions. He practiced the bland, public reassurances that a city official expected. "We are investigating. We ask the public to allow due process." There was no malice in his words, only the polite armor of someone who knew that language could blunt panic. Yet when a photographer angled for a better shot of the nursery window, his voice hardened. "Back up." Luis arrived with news in his hands and a kind of tired triumph that did not fit his face. He had been awake working through the ledger's numbers until dawn yawned into the neighborhood. He unfolded the scanned photograph and laid it on the kitchen table, where the house's old wood caught the light and seemed to hold its breath with them. "Harrison Cole at a charity dinner," Luis said. "That's him in the center. But look." He pointed to a man at the edge of the frame, smaller, partly in shadow, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "I found his name in the ledger. He's listed as a donor. Not just a donor. He appears to coordinate payments under different names. Shell entries." Emma leaned close. Chief Williams read the ledger's printing as if it might speak aloud. "You mapped the numbers?" he asked. Lewis had mapped them. He had stayed up threading payments to accounts that dissolved into other accounts, money that looked charitable on paper but ran like a current through foundations and companies that delivered influence instead of aid. Some entries went to familiar names, institutions whose logos decorated gala invitations, some to obscure consultancies, a few to individuals whose roles were not public at all. "This isn't just about one man," Lewis said. "It's a web. It touches the mayor's advisory board, a law firm that handles philanthropy, and," he swallowed, "I cross-referenced one of the shell companies. A fixer's name came up, Robert Klein. He arranges for things to disappear." At the sound of Klein's name, Emma's color changed. She knew the shorthand of power. The fixer was the city's quiet hand, the man who baked silence into things. Harrison Cole had the glamour and the stage. Klein had the machinery that kept glamour clean. While they spoke, the man who had once considered selling the ledger made his own arrangements. He sat in a chipped diner a few blocks away, a paper cup of coffee cooling as if it too had chosen to listen. The broker who met him wore an expensive indifference and a suit that cost as much as a month's rent in their building. He examined the ledger's pages briefly, like a man checking the quality of merchandise, then tapped a finger along a line. "You understand what this can do," the broker said. "I do." The ledger keeper's voice was thin but steady. He had not expected moral ambiguity to be his problem. He had expected offers and escape. "I don't want to be found." The broker smiled without warmth. "We don't expose you, we monetize. There's a difference." He spoke of anonymity and encryption and the kind of legal shelter that money bought. He promised a quick sale, a purchase that made the ledger someone else's risk. The ledger keeper thought of the house, of Mia's hands tucking Samuel's blanket. He imagined black vultures and bright headlines and chose, for a moment, the route of least courage. Back at the house, the first headlines hit like stones. A small outlet published a list of names, partial, messy, enough to startle but not enough to satisfy. The effect was immediate. Phones lit up, neighbors came to their windows, and the city's rumor mills coughed into flame. Harrison Cole's name was in the lead. His office released a statement that was as practiced as a dance. Denial of wrongdoing, a pledge to cooperate, a reminder of philanthropic good. Someone from Cole's circle called Chief Williams.
The voice on the line was soft and polite and full of implication. "We'd like to speak," the voice said, "for Mr. Cole. We want to help you get the facts right." Chief Williams listened as if the world's edges were being tested for a seam. "We're investigating," he said. The man thanked him and hung up with an economy of civility that left a cold in the room. Mia moved through the house like someone arranging furniture in a space that might be disassembled at any moment. She packed a small bag, Samuel's clothes, some diapers, a folded sweater. Chief Williams watched without comment. He had been a man of the department long enough to know that protection was not merely a matter of presence, but of plans. Alternate safe houses, checks on friends, a list of people authorized to visit. He asked Mia who she trusted. She named 3. Emma stayed on the porch. She had a story gnawing at her, the moral geometry of an exposé pressing. If she published, more names would surface. If she withheld, there might be safety for the small household. She thought of headlines, the moment of truth that comes with every journalist's hunger. And then she thought of Samuel's breathing behind a closed door. The two images collided until they made a kind of ruin. "Do what you think is right," Mia told her when Emma knelt to the porch steps. Her voice was not pleading. It was an invitation to responsibility. Luis took his findings to a man he trusted at the precinct, one of the plainclothes detectives who kept distance but kept watch. The detective's face turned the color of old paper as he read. "If the ledger is real," he said, "and those names are who you say, then we've got more than corruption. We've got people who will move to silence." There was a cadence to the morning now. A city waking, the headlights of more vans, the soft clack of keyboards as the ledger names metastasized into search queries and private messages. The man who brokered the ledger left the diner with the thick envelope in his coat. He felt the risk like a shadow at his feet, close enough to judge by smell. He did not yet know whether he had chosen to save himself or to seed other people's ruin. At midday, a car with dark windows rolled near the house and stopped 2 blocks away. A man in a suit got out and walked with a gait that suggested practiced purpose. He paused, glancing at the house as if counting its vulnerabilities. He did not approach. Instead, he took a phone call and then walked on, his silhouette a punctuation in the day's narrative. Chief Williams watched him from an upstairs window and felt that dangerous luxury, hope, harden into something else, the resolve to make sure that if a blade came down, it would meet a shield. He called the plainclothes team and ordered a widening of their net. He asked Luis to secure digital copies of the ledger and to create backups in ways that made the words more likely to survive than any human memory. Emma, finally, tucked her notebook back into her coat. She had a paragraph in mind she would not yet write, a headline deferred. That evening, as the city hummed with rumor and people turned conversation into verdicts, Mia sat at Samuel's bedside and read him a story she had started making for him in the quiet hours. About seeds planted in small, patient soil.
about how courage sometimes looked like staying and sometimes like walking away, about the difference, always, between revenge and repair. Through the window, lights went on in apartments and office towers like constellations returning from sleep. Somewhere, the broker counted his money and did not yet understand the weight of the names he had moved. Somewhere else, Harrison Cole paced beneath a chandelier and imagined lawsuits folded like origami around his life. The ledger's pages lay, in pieces now, like the margins of a map that had been scrawled in haste and might yet guide fortune or sorrow. Chief Williams closed the curtains and leaned his forehead against the glass. He could hear, faint and steady, the city's long business continuing, the hum of traffic, the distant shout of a vendor, the sob of a siren that might be nothing. He thought of the house and of the little life at its center, and of the men and women who would choose, in the days to come, whether to name and unmake secrets or to bury them under the polite soil of compromise. For now, they would guard what they had. For now, they would gather facts and friends and the fragile resource of time. Mia smoothed Samuel's hair with a hand that trembled only once, like an index finger testing a wind. She promised him, again, that she would teach him how to plant seeds, how to count the cost of name and of silence. Outside the curtains, the city breathed, restless and inevitable. A message arrived on Luis's phone, 2 words and a number that made his skin prickle. Meet. He showed Chief Williams. The detective who looked at the text saw it and understood. There were people hungry enough or desperate enough to turn ledger into violence. There were also people who could make it into exposure. They had to decide which of those outcomes the ledger would meet. They had to decide quickly.